I want to welcome to the stage Marcus Ransom from Melbourne, Australia. I always say it wrong. Anyway, Melbourne. We went back and forth on this, and I still can't get it right. It's the Midwestern in me. This session runs from 4 to 4:45. It's around device management under the hood. We would welcome you to ask questions at the end. There's a microphone right here on the right for question and answer. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Wow, yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. As Liz said, my name's Marcus Ransom. I'm a senior systems engineer at CompNow in Melbourne, Australia. I run Melbourne Apple Admins, the local meetup group, and I'm also one of the coordinators of XWorld, Australia's Mac Admin conference, where we have a wonderful partner, Jamf. Some of you may also recognise my voice from the Mac Admins podcast, which will be up on his stage after this session. So CompNow has been working with Jamf for many years. We were the first integrator in Australia, and we now support a large part of the Apple market in the region across education, enterprise and government. And you can see there some of the stats around sort of numbers of engineers, customers, those sorts of things. So just to quickly clear some things up. So Apple has recently moved away from using the term DEP or Device Enrollment Program. We're now talking about device enrollment in Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager. I'm probably going to still say DEP a number of times. Every time I do, I'll donate $1 to the Society for the Advancement of the Apple Style Guide. So what do we use device enrollment for? So we've seen this image a lot, the Post-it note. This is the dream we're all chasing, the fantastic user experience. So IBM showed us what they're doing to fulfill that dream. Joel is showing what he's doing with Jamf Connect. And many of us are also trying to do the same thing in our environment, creating fantastic user experience. But what's required to keep the duck to appear to be swimming smoothly above the water? What happens between steps 1 and 2 or before step 1 to get this to happen? So I'm going to break things down into 3 parts. We're going to have a quick rundown of what device enrollment is, and we're going to put device enrollment up on the hoist and have a poke about inside and see what's going on. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the tools and workflows that you can use when testing device enrollment in your environment and what you can do when things aren't going as they should. So device enrollment's essentially a way of automating the process of getting devices into your MDM. There's a bit more to it than that, but this is kind of what we're trying to do. It was launched in February 2014. When it came out, it was devices purchased from Apple, and it was USA only. So there were a lot of people around the world really excited about this, but there were some limitations around it. Late 2014, we saw approved resellers added into it and extended to 26 countries. And Australia was one of those, and we were really excited about that. Countries like Australia, we don't tend to purchase our devices directly through Apple. There's a very strong reseller chain where people get their devices from. So in 2016, we saw Apple School Manager Portal, the introduction of managed Apple IDs through the same portal, links to VPP. 2017, we saw iOS provisional enrollment, the ability to get devices that weren't procured through your standard supported device enrollment supply chain into device enrollment. 2018, we saw Apple Business Manager, and it's now 62 countries. There's some notable omissions in there. So Russia and China are not currently supported countries. So if you're an organisation that is based in those countries, or if you've got offices in those countries, things can get a little bit challenging, but we are seeing it expand out to more countries. So what are the requirements for device enrollment? So your organisation has to be registered with Apple. Apple requires a very secure trust chain between where the device came from and who's managing the device to ensure that nobody can get in the middle of it. Needs to be from an approved vendor, the little asterisk there, except for iOS provisional enrollment. These are the operating systems that are supported, but you're probably going to be wanting something as recent as possible to get the full benefit. Devices need to be purchased after March 2011. Another asterisk there, depending on where they came from, that organisation still needs to be registered with Apple. So how do we understand this amazing tool that Apple has provided us with? That's not one way. Let's look at the documentation. So there's a lot of high-level documentation out there for Apple School Manager, looking at configuring Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager, the device enrollment programs, especially the MDM side of things, how your MDM communicates with device enrollment and how all of that works. But there's not a lot that really explains the device side of things, what actually happens on the device, how the device communicates with device enrollment. There's a lot of detailed documentation about the Cloud Service API, the process where MDM Server communicates with Apple, which is really great for those of us who are building MDM servers. So, quick show of hands, who here has built an MDM protocol from scratch incorporating device enrollment? Yes, Charles, I thought you'd put your hand up. That's great. Really awesome documentation about the specification that Apple wants, but not all of us are really looking for that. Same goes for the vendor API, the system that vendors use to add devices to your device enrollment account. And this is all documented in the AppleCare Connect Web Services Implementation Guide. So another quick show of hands, how many folks here are vendors who need to interact with this service? So we'll see a couple of hands going up. There's a few more people doing that. So yeah, this is really useful information and it's really, really good documentation. It's also really interesting documentation, even if you're not interacting with that. So that just leaves us, the folks who are responsible for building the workflows that get these devices into the hands of our users. We want to make sure that the onboarding is a good experience. We want detailed documentation that we can give to security teams, infrastructure teams, so they can understand what needs to be going on to get this process to happen. We want to find that documentation in centralised, easy to find location. So we go to Apple's knowledge base. We look at the TCP and UDP ports. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this article here. You know, we know that it relies on 443 to apple.com. That's the sort of things we're talking about. We want some specific information. So if we do a quick search on this page here for DEP or device enrollment, we don't see anything here as to what specific network ports we're using. But we do have, in this document here, HT 207516, we've got a list of requirements for MDM enrollment. There's some interesting terminology in here, and we'll get to this later on. But we can see here network requirements, where your device needs to be going when it's doing its MDM and device enrollment. This is usually the case. The Mac admin community has filled the gaps in documentation. So a big shout out to the folks at MicroMDM. We've got a great wiki that lists some troubleshooting tips, not just for device enrollment, but for MDM in general. So they've compiled a list of sort of steps, troubleshooting, those sorts of things that I know I've referred to a lot when I'm trying to understand how this process works. So why is this so important now? So this year, the reliance on device enrollment became a lot more important. We've got user-approved MDM, user-approved kernel extension loading, things that are making it pretty much mandatory these days to use device enrollment to onboard devices. If you want to streamline your device enrollment, we've got TCC or PPPCPCP in Mojave, and we've got new hardware coming out that's running secure boot out of the box, and it's making avoiding device enrollment a lot harder to maintain. And next week, we're probably going to see some more devices. We're seeing a pattern here. So this is interesting if you're a country that's still not on the device enrollment list. So this led to a lot of admins running around like this when they came across issues. And I was one of them. So I was having problems with device enrollment, especially on Macs. My colleagues and peers were having problems with device enrollment, especially on Macs. Especially on Macs, on networks with proxies. And I wanted to know why and how to make it all work, which is why I decided to find out what was going on underneath the surface. What was not in the documentation? How did all of this work? So let's have a look at what's actually going on with device enrollment, from getting your devices into your account, making MDM aware of them, and then the actual enrolment process on the device. So to simplify things, we're breaking it down into 3 pieces. We've got the vendor API, which is how where you procure the devices from communicates that information up to your device enrolment portal. The cloud API, which is how your MDM communicates with that portal to understand which devices you have. And then the private API, which is what's running on the device, and that's communicating with device enrolment. So step 1, the organisation has to be enrolled. So Apple wants to verify your credentials. You have to demonstrate that you are in fact a company, a legitimate company. And then you get assigned an institutional DEP, it's interesting, they're still using that term there, customer ID. That's your unique identifier so Apple knows who you are. And you also need to whitelist any vendors for them to be able to put devices into your portal. Now, it's interesting to note that whitelisting the vendors on its own doesn't add your devices into the portal. The vendor actually needs to perform another step. It may be that that vendor is going to do that automatically, or it may not. So it's good to check with those vendors. So let's have a look at how this process works. So when you buy a device from, say, a fantastic reseller like CompNow, they get your serial number. And they combine that with your customer ID, their reseller ID, and they convert this to JSON, and then this is pushed up to Apple. And this is called in the API a bulk upload, where they can do multiple devices at once up to Apple. It uses OAuth certificates to ensure this chain of trust that Apple want to be secure. Now, there's some other API uploads they can do. They can perform check transaction status and show order details, so they can find out more information as to what's up there and to make sure that the correct devices are up there and able to be seen. So now the customer gets to see this device in their DEP portal, their device enrolment portal. To be able to allocate it to an MDM server, first we need to establish this link between our MDM server and the device enrolment program. Now, interesting note here that I've heard a lot of people saying they're trying to just enter serial numbers into their portal to add devices to device enrolment. Now, that's not how this works. If you enter a serial number that hasn't been added, you get an error message, and in the log files you get a not accessible error. And that just means that serial number's not in your portal and you need to speak to the vendor that you got that serial number from. So how do we get this chain of trust with the cloud API between your MDM server and Apple? So in Jamf Pro, we generate a public and private key, and the public key gets uploaded to the device enrolment portal, where that SMIME encrypts a server token, which we download and install into Jamf Pro. So this token is what's used to authenticate to mdmenrollment.apple.com. And so now we can see the MDM server in our device enrolment portal. Now, an interesting thing there is you can set default MDM server. So if you see your MDM server showing up green in that list, that means that's a default server for a particular hardware type. So you're able to have your iPhones going into one MDM, your iPads going into another, Macs into another one. So that's a really useful feature which Apple School Manager has had for a while, and this year has come to Apple Business Manager. So now we can see all the devices that we've got allocated in our device enrolment program for that MDM in Jamf Pro. So how does that work? That's the Cloud Service API, which is a RESTful API, and that's got 2 functions. The first one is to sync device records down from the device enrolment portal, so Jamf Pro knows what devices you've got the ability to control and some information about them. And the second part is to synchronize device enrolment profiles back up to Apple from the MDM server that Apple can then deliver to the devices later on. So that device sync is a list that it brings down of all the devices allocated to the MDM server that we created in our Apple School Manager or Business Manager portal, and letting it know. Now, remember that this happens on a schedule. This is not instant. The second you add those serial numbers to an MDM server, you've got to wait for the time that your MDM server does that regular synchronization, or you can go in and hit the manual sync button. So let's see how this works. So using the server token we established earlier, Jamf Pro Server requests information from mdmenrollment.apple.com, which provides either an initial full list the first time you do that synchronization, or any new records or new information since the last synchronization. So now your MDM server can see the devices that you've got in there and the information about them. So the second part of this API is posting information back to Apple about what we want these devices to do when they activate and check in. So whatever settings we configure in our pre-stage enrolment, these get posted back up to mdmenrollment.apple.com. So converts that to JSON, and when you hit save, that gets sent back up to mdmenrollment.apple and keeps that ready for the next time a device checks in. So now let's get to the fun bit. This is a part that doesn't have a great deal of documentation. This is the part that happens on a device. And this has been referred to as the private API because it's not officially documented and it's not really accessible by anything other than the binaries on the device. So we boot a Mac. First boot, we get the language screen. Now we can see there the user that's running as root. So we'll get to that later because that's interesting. So as soon as you select language, the device is going to look for a network connection. If it doesn't have an active network connection, it's going to prompt you to connect to a network or to move on without a network connection. So as all of this is happening, MacBuddy, or the setup assistant's running in the GUI, asking you to select keyboard and country. And this triggers a launch daemon looking for Cloud Configuration D. We can see here this is now running as MB setup user. It's moved away from root. So this fetches a certificate using HTTP GET from iprofiles.apple.com and combines this certificate with your serial number, and it uses this to request and encrypt the traffic to Apple. So it creates a JSON dictionary containing the serial number and the command request profile configuration and posts that up to iprofiles.apple.com session, gets a session key. Performs an HTTP post, again with that session key, to iprofiles.apple.com Mac profile. And this returns a JSON dictionary which reflects the activation record that the MDM posted up to your device enrollment portal. And this is when we see the remote management window. So you'll have a look here. The device enrollment side of things has only communicated with Apple at this stage. It hasn't actually needed to speak to your MDM server at all. The information it's getting about your MDM server comes from that activation record that Apple delivered to it. So when we hit continue, meanwhile, in the background, the Apple push notification service is also setting itself up parallel to this. It's going out to push.apple.com, getting a bag file from there. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Bradley Chapman did a fantastic session last year, a Push Odyssey. If you're interested in what's going on there, have a look at that session. That was one of the sessions that made me really want to understand what was going on in devices. So we need that push notification working so that we can do the next bit, which is the MDM enrollment. So at this stage now, our computer is aware of where our MDM server is and what it needs to enroll in. So MDM client's taken over from Cloud Config D. So we can see here, it goes out and gets that enrollment record. We can prompt to authenticate. At the moment, it's basic authentication. That's something that would be really awesome to see change. We're still running as MB setup user. So after MDM enrollment finishes, Jamf sends an install application command to bring the Jamf binary down. After that's installed, we get the enrollment complete trigger. So we can see here, depending on what the user's doing, we may still be sitting at the setup assistant. Now, as we heard this morning, this process is likely to change a bit with the await configuration, but at the moment, the amount of time that the user spends on this screen determines how many of the packages that we get down, any of the configuration we're doing in Jamf. That may be happening if they're spending a lot of time trying to work out what icon they want. That enrollment process and all the installation may have been completed. But if they're someone that's just going to go through and hit enter, 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 it may have already gone through and started running in the user space, beginning to log into their machine. So a lot of people who have written their own splash screens are trying to work out how they can get something to run when it's in the user space. And a lot of people are using the sign of the doc process starting as when they want their applications to start running and showing the user what's going on their device. So that's where understanding which user is running and what sort of things can speed up or slow down the process are really important for testing. So that's when we can configure something like this to give that great onboarding experience for our users. So as you can see, there's a few more steps that we've got to run through other than 1 and 2, but the trick is to ensure that that's the experience for the user. We want it to be seamless to them. We want to remove any roadblocks there are to reliability. So what can we do to ensure that this happens? How can we test this? How do we look for all the variables that might come in between our users and a really good experience? So if you see this screen, unless you're allowing users to migrate their data, it's a sign that things may not have gone to plan. This is where I often hear people suggesting DEP's down, it's not working, there's problems with this. Now, there's certainly been a couple of occasions where that's the case, and it's been my experience that there's usually something else going on that's preventing this from working, and it's causing the device not to receive its activation record. So after much encouragement, Apple have added device enrolment to the system status page, which is fantastic. Haven't been too many occasions where this is not functioning. Which part of device enrolment does this represent? Is this a vendor API? Probably not. Is this a cloud API or is this a private API? We're having communication. They're talking to different endpoints. Which one is functioning, which one's not working? So, testing and troubleshooting. We know that we can get a Mac to bypass device enrolment if there's no network connection. Or there might be some issues with the network connection that's preventing it from seeing device enrolment and getting that activation record. It might be proxies, SSL inspection, brutal firewall rules. The cloud configuration D process begins as soon as your device connects to a network and can get out. But that might be after the user has already logged in. That's when they're going to see something like this, if they've got admin rights. What's different from this to the managed setup we wanted to do before? They might have migrated 15 years of Adobe preferences across. They might have installed applications that were on their old machine or in their Time Machine backup that you wanted to configure brand new, or might have had different serial numbers. So, this can be a really useful process for onboarding existing machines, but you need to be mindful that those machines are now not necessarily in a known state. So this is one that got me on a few occasions. I don't know if we can see it there, but it's saying the data couldn't be read because it isn't in the correct format. So I was looking at the information, trying to work out what's wrong with the format. Have I got a language setting wrong? Why is it not able to read it? What it means is, hey, go and check your MDM because it isn't working properly. It turns out I'd been doing some infrastructure changes on my dev MDM and Tomcat wasn't started. So device enrolment wasn't working. So the device knew it was going to enroll, but it's not getting anything back, which from a certain point of view is the incorrect format. So, you'll see messages like this where device enrolment is working perfectly. It was Marcus who was not working properly that day. How do you troubleshoot the setup assistant when there isn't a proper GUI? There's an awesome trick you can use to open up terminal at the setup assistant, Command-Control-T. Having a terminal session allows you to check all sorts of things about the state of the machine. What's the status of the network? Can it ping? What IP address does it have? Is it on the right VLAN? What's the date and time? Command-Control-Option-C brings up console, where you can launch Activity Monitor. It brings up console, and you can launch Activity Monitor from the command prompt. So you now have access to a bunch of tools that allow you to find out what's going on with the machine. Now, these are not things that you'd be wanting an end user to be running, but as an admin, these are things that we can use to understand what is it in our process and our workflow and environment that's not working. Now, so this is why it's important to know what user was running at the language screen, because the setup assistant we're running as MB setup user, that's useful. We can go and look at things and find out what's going on. But the language screen is running us root, and root is useful because we can actually change things as long as they're not a location protected by system integrity protection. So one of the things I've found is if you want to get that language screen, but it's a machine that's been reinstalled rather than fresh out of the box, there's this little command here where you boot into recovery, touch volumes, Macintosh HD, VARDB, run language chooser 2. That's the file that's on your machine when it comes fresh from the factory. And so if you reboot that machine, you're going to get the language chooser at the setup assistant, which allows you to get a root shell, which you can go in and start doing some interesting things. Most useful items to look for are the trigger files. Now these live in VARDB configuration profile settings. Now the combination of these files reveals the status of the machine and its activation record. This is where the machine writes out the information that it finds when it contacts the device enrolment portal iProfiles and what it gets back. The combination of those files are really important. Now, the other thing to remember is these are cached on the machine. Once Cloud Configuration D has run and has gone out and fetched these trigger files, it's not going to go out looking for them again. So you may have not been enrolled in a pre-stage and gone and changed that and rebooted the machine. It's not going to go out looking for them because it's got these trigger files on there. Now, these are in a system integrity protected location, so you can't delete these files. You could boot to recovery and delete those files, but I like to look at SIP as Apple saying, leave these files alone. So if I go and delete things that are protected by that, this machine's in an unsupported state, and I don't really want to use that for testing and troubleshooting. So we can see here, Cloud Config has activation record. That device has gone up to iProfiles.com, and iProfile says, yes, you have an activation record. The next one below it, Cloud Config record found. Can we see what's interesting about that file? The size of that file. That's not just a straight touch file. There's actually some meat in there. So we go and have a look at what's in there, and we can see that's our pre-stage. That's all the information about the setup assistant, what we want the device to do, that's cached on the machine. So if that was from a previous pre-stage, we can go in there and have a look at what's the URL, what's the setup assistant steps. That can tell you when that pre-stage enrollment was cached. Have a look at the date on it. I've seen ones where it's like, oh, this is actually a couple of years old. I think this machine might have been booted when there was some testing happening. That's what's gone wrong with it. Now, the number one reason I have found for DEP is not working is that device was not in device enrollment or had a pre-stage scoped when it was first booted. Now, that may have been that the device was unintentionally booted. Someone was testing the machines to see if they'd boot, to make sure that there were no hardware problems before they rolled them out. That's a really good thing to do for planning. Might have been connected to a network. The pre-stage was not scoped, or the wrong pre-stage was scoped. I've had this happen to me before, where the device was booted immediately after the pre-stage was scoped and the activation record hadn't populated across Apple's CDN. Apple's CDN's pretty good, but if I hit save and then boot, I might beat it depending on, where we are or, how good your internet connection is. Clock skew is another one. So here we can see it's stuck on retrieving activation record, and it's not really getting anywhere. The gear wheel's just spinning around. And if we throw up a terminal window, we can see that the Mac thinks, in this case, it's 1971, and that's not a good year for SSL certs. It's determined that there is an activation record for the device, but when it's trying to get that activation record, it's not been able to download, and that's a good thing, because we want things to be secure. So how do we fix that? And what could have happened? The machine may have been turned off for some time, wiped, reinstall the OS and put it in a cupboard waiting for the next customer to come and get it. Battery's gone flat. Environment might be blocking NTP on their network because, that's a really important thing to make sure that the clock isn't set properly. So what do we do there? We boot to recovery, or if we've got a command, a root shell open, I like to set the clock using the date command. So NTP date is gone in Mojave, so you can use SMTP, but I like to use the date because there may be problems with NTP, so I want something that's a little bit more brute force. It'll get it kind of close enough so we can get the SSL cert happening and then get the configuration for the right time server. We can see this is a Mac that wasn't scoped to a pre-stage, so it's got Cloud Config, no activation record. It's gone up to iProfiles.apple.com and it said, I got nothing for you. Cloud Config record not found. There is nothing there. Now, if you see the top activation record but no activation record found, the network might be preventing clear communication or performing SSL inspection for Apple. Now, when we're talking about certificates, we want to make sure it's the right certificate that's being used. Monitoring network traffic. So I've been using Little Snitch to monitor my network, and I can see my host machine's network and what's going on. So when I filter by the Cloud Config D process there, I can see it's HTTP access to iProfiles.apple.com. Now, don't whitelist via IP addresses. So it's been known in certain areas of the world to sometimes not appear on the 17/8 network where we expect to see all traffic. It's usually there. Sometimes it might be on one of Apple's CDNs. So, my recommendation to a lot of our customers is we really want to be, whitelist that, but also star.apple.com. So back to HT207516. let's have a look at these network requirements. So what is Apple recommending that we need to have open? So albert.apple.com, this is where the activation servers live. iprofiles.apple.com is device enrollment. Now the next three are for verifying that any certificates the device is going to trust haven't been revoked. These are not on apple.com, so we've got to have that discussion with our security team about opening up the firewall, the proxies, everything to more ports. Now, security teams often don't want to do that because security. So these are for verifying that any certificates on the device haven't been revoked, and we know there's some certificates about to get revoked. So explaining to security teams that we need to open up more of our network to be more secure. I don't want to do that. Well, so you're happy for this device to have an untrusted certificate on it. So the last line here links to some additional information about APNS that we'll get back to later, but further down we can see the only reference to your MDM server, no reference of ports, proxies, SSL inspection. Now there's a reason for that, because different MDM providers run their system differently. You know, Jamf, we all know 8443, or it's 443 if we're in Jamf Cloud, but Apple wants to provide general documentation for everyone. So this is where you consult your MDM provider to know what they need you to be opening and running to support this. And so we can see here, to complete setup, your iPhone, iPad or iPod Touch must be connected to a network that has access to your MDM server. Probably needs a little bit more than that. So back to the, if you're not getting Apple push notifications. So this is a great document here. It gives us very specific information and the first language about how fussy this is. It says we need direct and persistent connection. Direct and unproxied connection for APNS. Now it's interesting that it doesn't reference HTTP2, which we all know is where APNS is moving to. But it refers us back to the document, the ports that Apple services use. So how do we find out what our devices are needing to contact and where the information is going specific to our environment? How do we get rid of these roadblocks? So things that I've found that are really problematic: authenticated or manual proxies. Mojave is getting a lot better at dealing with proxies, but if you've got an environment that's got authenticated or manual proxies, you're probably going to have a lot of difficulty with device enrollment. SSL inspection. Device enrollment and a good MDM is going to use certificate pinning, so SSL inspection is really going to give you a lot of trouble. Firewall ports, blocking ports and addresses, even when we've been told that they're open, we want to be able to check to see if they're able to get through. A flooded network. I've had scenarios where we're building labs of machines. The first bunch get on and enroll in device enrollment, but the switch is getting, you know, full up of all of the packages that are coming down, and the devices just can't get out to the device enrollment servers and back in the timely fashion that it needs. So you want to make sure you've got really good access out to Apple for those devices. So one of the things that I've found that's really good is having a look while the device is at the setup assistant, the remote management screen, and seeing what it's doing. So we can see we can boot the machine here. It's activating albert.apple.com. It's checking some certificates. This is also a really good thing to show security teams of exactly where the device is going. So we can see iprofiles.apple.com. It's gone out and it's got that activation record. There's all of those other services like APNS, checking the time, checking for software updates that are happening out in the background. And we can see all of those certificates. Now, interesting, I can see here, this is DigiCert it's going to, not the VeriSign that was in that document from Apple. So maybe there might be some regional differences or things have changed since that document. And we can also see eventually that will show jamfcloud.com in this. So this is where the device has gone through and done that enrollment. We can only see fairly late on in the piece where it's really talking to things outside of that initial Apple configuration. So the best way to observe this in real time is in a virtual machine. So because device enrollment is essentially a RESTful API, it uses a serial number for identification. And we can put that serial into the config of a virtual machine, and we can use virtualization concepts like link clones, snapshots, and rapid testing. So do not use a serial number from a live machine. So Ross Deruenko from Ping has got a great write-up on how to get this working. I'm going to have links at the end to all of these articles. If you use a serial number from a live machine, the user's going to get this happening while you're testing, which isn't probably what you want them to happen. So serial numbers from dead machines that are never going to boot again. If you've got those in your device enrollment portal, they're incredibly useful. So Duo Security have recently had a bit to say about this process. Their research is amazing, and they're right that this ability to spoof a serial number and enroll devices opens up some possibilities for exploits, which is why the option of having authentication checked in your pre-stage is probably the most secure option. I've got a link to this article in the notes as well. So remediation, what do we do on a device when things haven't gone the way we want? And how can we work out how to get that device back into being enrolled and going through the process? So pre-10.13.4, MDM client had DEP NAG that we could use that would trigger that NAG screen to come up and enroll the device. But it's now moved into the profiles command. So we can see these 3 commands here. Profiles show type enrollment. That's going to go out to iprofiles.apple.com, and it's going to show you what the activation record is on iprofiles.apple.com. Status type enrollment shows you the current state of the device, whether it was enrolled with device enrollment program, whether it's user approved MDM. The last one is interesting, renew type enrollment. This brings down the current activation record and puts that trigger file in there with that activation record. But when I was testing this, it's like, okay, it's got the right activation record on it, but I go forward and I'm still getting that migrate your user data. Why is this not working? So it used to be that people were saying, you know, go boot into recovery and delete the var.db configuration profiles file, which is system integrity protection protected. Delete the APNS keychain, the APSD keychain, and touch Apple setup done so the device can go back through. Now, that hasn't worked as reliably on more recent operating systems. I'm finding in Mojave that it's not rebuilding those folders again in configuration profiles, so it's got nowhere to put those activation records. As I said before, I don't like removing things that are in system integrity protected folders because Apple's kind of told us not to. So how do we get a device to go through the process again when we're testing? So I found a way that I'm able to do this. So the first thing is work out why the device wasn't pulling down the activation record. Generally, it's rescoping the pre-stage and verifying that the correct pre-stage is in iprofiles.apple.com. Get yourself a terminal window running as root. We saw how to do that. You can generally, on a fresh out-of-the-box machine, go right back through the setup assistant and you're going to get that language screen. Or boot to recovery, touch that file, get things running again. Sudo profiles renew type enrollment, bring down the activation record. Reboot again, and that's going to start the MacBuddy process again, and then it's going to kick off that device enrollment process. Now, I've actually found a way to do this that if the planets are aligned without a reboot, if you keep yourself at the language screen when you're doing your testing, you go right back, you keep yourself at the language screen, when you go forward, I've found MacBuddy starts again, Cloud Configuration D starts again, it reads the new activation record that you've got, and it goes through and gets the remote management screen. I've also found it works the other way. If you've got a device that's scoped to a pre-stage and you don't want it to be, you can go back and do this and get it to then not be enrolled in device enrollment. So the one thing I would say about that is your mileage may vary. We're still kind of sitting in the unsupported territory here, but this is a really good workflow for testing and seeing what's going on. The most reliable solution I've found is nuke and pave, is to wipe the machine and start again. But you know, if you're in a hurry to get something out, you may find that this works for you. Another interesting process is this article here, repaired devices. If your Mac's repaired and they've done their job properly and put the serial number in again, nothing's changed. It's going to be giving that serial number up when it boots, and everything's going to work properly. iOS devices. When you get an iOS device replaced by an authorized service center, the replacement device takes the place of the device enrollment record of the original device. If it was scoped to an MDM server in your device enrollment portal, the new device will retain that scoping to an MDM server. Apple has control over that in your device enrollment portal. What they don't have control over is your Jamf Pro instance, which pre-stage it was scoped to. Jamf is going to see a different serial number and it's going to treat that as a different device. So if your customer is just going to restart that device and try and enroll it straight after their Genius Bar appointment, that may not work. You may want to advise them if they get their device replaced that there's a process you want them to go through. So the conclusion is I've found the secret to a smooth device enrolment is clear network access. APNS, your MDM server, those certificate verification sites. Test your workflow. Look for all of the edge cases. What can go wrong? What different environments, what may we be trying to perform this process in? And understand the limitations. Not just how device enrolment works, but understand how device enrolment doesn't work, how it wasn't designed to work, and plan accordingly and have troubleshooting steps other than, like I did, running around and saying that DEP is down. Now, if you've ever documented your experience with device enrolment, thank you. I didn't really come across any of this information myself. It was really lots of fun playing around with Hopper, Cloud Configuration D, having a look at what's going on. But there's amazing information out there that community has provided, which has allowed me to be able to understand the process and what's going on there. There's some really great conference presentations. So Micro MDM, Jesse and Victor demystifying MDM at PSU Mac Admins. As I referred to, Bradley Chapman at JNUC. And then at Black Hat this year, Jesse Endal and Max Belanger, fantastic information about the API. They've found some interesting things with install application. James Barclay from Duo Security, MDM, Me Maybe, really, really awesome information that helped me understand what was going on. So before you try and write all of these down or take any photos, I've got a link at the end. So I'll just show you. There is actually a lot of information out there. It's just about knowing where it is and how to put all of the pieces together. So I've got a link here. I've got all of those links on my blog there. Maybe some of your firewalls might struggle with the name of my blog, but that's where it is. Thank you very much. I hope people got some value out of this. If you've got any questions, come and see me afterwards. I'll be the guy in the extremely loud pants. Thank you.